Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Elaine, and I produce the Writing for Your Life conferences. Thank you for joining us at this very first Writing for Your Life online writers conference. Our hashtag is writingforyourlife.com if you would like to use it on social media. And this evening, I'm very pleased to have with us my great friend, Rachel Held Evans. Rachel is a New York Times bestselling author whose books include Faith Unraveled, A Year of Biblical Womanhood, and Searching for Sunday. Hailing from Dayton, Tennessee, home of the famous Scopes monkey trial in 1925, she writes about faith, doubt, and life in the Bible Belt. Rachel has been featured in the Washington Post, The Guardian, Christianity Today, Slate, The Huffington Post, CNN Belief Blog, NPR, BBC, Today Show, and The View, and who knows how many other places since then. Rachel also served as a keynote speaker at the inaugural Frederick Buechner Writers Workshop at Princeton Seminary and will be featured at the Writing for Your Life Writers Conference at Western Seminary in May 2017. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us today.
Oh my goodness, it's such a pleasure to be here, and hello everybody on the interwebs. It's an honor to be invited.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for joining us. You can go ahead and jump into your presentation. That'd be great.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be in the company of some of these other writers who are participating. I got to listen in on Sarah's presentation a little bit today, which was like the kick in the pants that I needed as far as actually getting some writing done, which my husband and I are adjusting to life with a 7-month-old, and it's been harder than ever to get writing done. And so she had some really helpful tips. It's just great to be part of a writing seminar that I really genuinely think has a lot of value and will be useful to writers. I complain often about how some of the material out there for writers isn't actually that helpful because it's not coming from people who actually do the work of writing. So this is great. This is the exception to the rule, and it's just awesome to be here. And so I want to start a little bit by talking about how I got my start as a writer. And I do have a fun picture to go along with this. Okay, this is also a good chance to test out PowerPoint, make sure I'm doing it right. Okay, this is a picture of me dressed up as an author for Career Day. I've known since I was a child that this is what I wanted to do with my life. I remember I was a voracious reader when I was a child, and I remember there was a Reading Rainbow episode all about how some people are authors, and that's what they do for a job. And I was awestruck, and I knew the minute I saw it, that's what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so for Career Day at school, I told my mom, I want to be a writer. And I remember her kind of saying to me, you sure you don't want to be like a chef or something, like a firefighter or something that has a little bit more obvious dress? But she put the little glasses on my face and gave me a little legal pad, and I've never dressed like that a day in my life as an author. I would have just worn pajamas if I'd known that's what you actually wear when you're doing the job. But this is all just to say I knew from an early age that this is what I wanted to do. And then I went on and worked for a daily newspaper. First I went to college and studied English literature. I worked for the student newspaper. Then went on to write for a daily paper and then for a small local paper here in Dayton, Tennessee, which all of that got me accustomed to writing on a deadline and was excellent experience. And then I paid my dues, writing stuff that I didn't really care that much about. Like I did PR and marketing for the local hospital, that kind of work. And yeah, so I paid my dues, and that's kind of how I got my start. But around the time when I was doing a lot of that freelance stuff, I'm going to put myself back on the screen. Hold on. There I am. Around the time that I was doing some of that freelance writing, PR marketing, just kind of paying my dues to try and pay the bills, I started working on my first book, Evolving in Monkey Town was the original title. And it was published when I was 29 years old. And I remember thinking at the time, maybe 29 is a little too young to be doing this. And that's one of the reasons why I'm calling this this webinar, this presentation, Who Do You Think You Are? Writing a meaningful memoir in the overshare age. It's because that question, who do you think you are, really hounded me in those first years as I was writing and trying to get published. In an age where everyone is curating their lives on Instagram and Facebook, who are you to add something new to all of the noise? I think it's easy to wonder if there's a place for your voice, and it's easy to wonder if it's hubris to share about your life or to write personal narrative when so many other people are doing the exact same thing. And we all are familiar with the condescending Wonka that has become ubiquitous in our culture. And that's what always kind of floats to my mind when I'm having days of insecurity. I can just see him saying, oh, so you think you're a good writer then? Or, oh, so you're 29 and you're writing a memoir. You must have so many interesting experiences. I think all of us have a few condescending Wonkas like floating around in our brain as we write. So something I want to encourage you all with is, this is a quote, one of my favorite quotes from Sylvia Plath. Everything in life is writable about if you have the outgoing guts to do it and the imagination to improvise. The worst enemy to creativity is self-doubt. So the point I want to make is that it's more important than ever to know exactly who you are as an artist and as a person, if you want to do creative, meaningful creative work and in a sustainable way. And so tonight I'm going to share some strategies for how to develop a strong, believable voice that sets you apart from other writers and gives you that signature style that the best writers have. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to take care of yourself as a person so you can continue to do this kind of work in a sustainable way. But first, I want to make some book recommendations because there's some things you really have to read if you're going to do this. Okay, here I am again. Okay, these are the books that you absolutely must read if you're going to be writing any sort of personal narrative, whether that's a memoir or whether you're writing a blog. And these are just my very top picks. The best book I have read by far in ages on this is Mary Karr's The Art of Memoir. And it just came out on paperback like last week. So you were in luck. Mary Karr is one of my very favorite all-time memoir writers. So when I found out she was writing a book about how to write memoirs, I was like, this is great news for all of us. And it was so encouraging to read it because I felt like she was talking about some things that I was already doing in my memoirs, and that made me feel really good about myself. But then she also it's just the most practical book that addresses a lot of the specific challenges you run into as you're writing a memoir or as you're writing any sort of personal narrative. So The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr. You read anything else, read that. Everybody Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. And I return to this one often. It's a great book by a great memoirist about writing. Another one of my favorites is Madeleine L'Engle's Walking on Water. This one's a little bit more on the philosophical end of things, but some of her insights into the life of a writer and the challenges of a writer's day-to-day are incredibly helpful, especially if you write the kind of thing that she wrote, which is a lot of memoir, but then also fiction, and just, she's amazing. And then one that you might not have heard of that I definitely want to recommend is my friend Michael Gungor has written a book called The Crowd, the Critic, and the Muse. And this one is especially helpful for those of you who are writing online because he deals with a lot of the insecurities and the angst and the challenges of writing for an online audience, and just the world we live in with all of the instant feedback, how that can sort of slowly wear down an artist, and how to recharge your soul and your heart and your mind. So I highly recommend that one as well, especially for those of you who are here because you're blogging. So those are my book recommendations, and all of them will tell you the same thing. And this is what I want to focus on a bit tonight, is that what makes a memoir work, a memoir or any sort of personal narrative, blog, creative nonfiction, what makes it work, it lives or dies by the strength of the voice and the believability of that author's voice. And so if you take anything away from tonight, it's the importance of developing, fleshing out, thinking through, and being very deliberate about your unique voice. I probably get 5 or 6 books in the mail every single week. And people are wanting me to blog about them or give them a shout out on Facebook or whatever. And I can open those books up, and within 2 paragraphs, I can tell you whether or not the writer has developed a unique and compelling voice. And if within those 2 paragraphs, I decide whether or not I'm going to read on, because it's instant. You know it the minute you read it. You know this person isn't necessarily saying something new, but they're saying it in a new way. It's all about voice, and that's kind of what I want to focus on tonight. And because whenever I'm asked to talk about writing, I always end up just doing like this crazy brain dump. And I'm just like, all these thoughts are coming, and I try to be organized, but I have so many thoughts. So I've organized this around my inspiration board. Every writer I know has one of these hanging above their desk. And I'm the same. And this is my inspiration board, and I have some close-up pictures of it. And it's full of all of these little mantras that I tell myself as I'm working. And I kind of just want to work through those with you all. Usually it's in my office, but my office got moved to make room for the nursery, and now my office is in the basement, and it's scary down there and very, very dark. So I moved it up here so you all could see it. So here's a close-up of my inspiration board. You can see there's a lot going on there. I have some souvenirs like from The View. I have my visitor's badge, and that little author ribbon was from a book festival I went to before I was published, and I stole it because I wanted to be an author someday, and I wanted to put it on my inspiration board. And so a lot of these are kind of just your basic how to stay on track, very common writer mantras. I have a reminder that my #1 job, my job description every single day when I sit down to write is just to tell the truth. That's your job as a writer. I have a reminder to write for the kindred spirits, not the critics. I'm the type who tends to try to kind of anticipate every critique. I hedge a lot. I put a lot of disclaimers in there, all because I'm writing with the critics in mind, when what I need to be doing is writing for the kindred spirits who are eager to receive what I have to say. And then, of course, I have the reminder to just take it bird by bird, which is from Anne Lamont's book that's titled that. And that's just a reminder that when you get overwhelmed, when you have too many, when a deadline's looming and you feel overwhelmed by how much more you have to go, and you're thinking, I have to write a book, that's a reminder that no, you just have to write the next sentence. Just take it bird by bird, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. Do just the next thing. And similarly, you see the one true sentence that's displayed prominently. And that, of course, is from Hemingway's famous advice to writers, where he talks about not knowing what to do next and getting stuck and facing writer's block. And he would look out over the city of Paris, which to me is an advantage that most of us do not have. But he would look out over the city of Paris and tell himself not to worry. You've written before, you will write again. All you have to do is write one true sentence. Write the truest sentence that you know. And so he said that finally he would be able to arrive at that one true sentence, and he could go from there. And it's certainly great advice. Another great piece of advice from Hemingway, while we're on it, is, and this has been super helpful to me, is to sometimes when you're in a writing session, you think, I'll stop when I get to the end of this paragraph, or I'll stop when I get to the end of this chapter. Hemingway suggests, and I have found this to be very true, that you leave a little bit left to do, so that when you sit down again to write, you are able to pick up where you left off, because nothing is harder in the world than just starting. Starting is the hardest part of writing. So if your writing day begins every single time with having to start something brand new, you're kind of making an enemy with yourself. So leave a little bit something to pick up the next day. And then I've got a reminder to be faithful to the work. This is from Madeleine L'Engle's Walking on Water, and she's talking about how Mary was obedient, and that similarly writers have to be obedient to the call before them, which basically just means that even if it means sentence, even if it means rearranging things, even if it means cutting out an entire chapter or letting it sit for a while, you have to be faithful to whatever the work wants to be. You have to be faithful to the creative work as it's emerging. I think a best example I have of this is that what I've been running up against as I'm writing the book I'm working on now, which is my 4th book, is that I really liked my 3rd book. I thought it was my best writing. I'm really, really proud of Searching for Sunday. And I kept trying to do that again with book number 4, is kind of repeat. It worked last time, I'll just do the same thing. But that's not what this book wants to be. That this next book is not as much personal narrative. It's a different subject matter. I'm incorporating some fiction, and it's its own unique project. And so I have to remind myself to be faithful to the work that's before me, not to try and make it into something it's not supposed to be. And that can be hard because you have to kill some of your favorite sentences and paragraphs, and sometimes you have to start from scratch. So, and then just the reminder to show up and be faithful. I've got a reminder to edit for story, which is just good advice for anybody who's doing any sort of creative work, is to cut the stuff out that doesn't move the story along. That can be hard when you're really proud of that flowery, gorgeous, super smart, well-researched paragraph that contributes nothing to the story. Cut it out. That's my reminder. And then, most importantly, the reminder that the next sentence is not in the refrigerator, because sometimes I look for it there. I'm one of those people who just goes for the muffin when she can't think of what to do next. But what I really want to focus on from my inspiration board, the mantra that I think is most important for creative nonfiction writers, personal narrative writers, memoir writers to keep in mind, is the importance of being a likable narrator. And this brings us back to the idea of voice and developing your unique, compelling, interesting voice. So before I wrote my first book, which was a memoir, I went through all of my very favorite spiritual memoirs, and 10 or 15 probably, and reread them all and took copious notes on what I observed each of those writers doing. And I paid special attention to what they did in their first chapter. And there were several themes that emerged, but one that I thought was most interesting and most surprising was that every single author within the first chapter, and often within the first few pages, had some sort of self-depreciating joke, a little bit of a joke on themselves. Anne Lamont's was, "I started writing sophomoric articles for the college paper. Luckily, I was a sophomore," which I think is just delightful. And I realized the reason they were doing this, that it was deliberate. The reason they were doing this was because it helped establish trust with the reader. I don't believe somebody who can't poke fun at themselves or that takes themselves too seriously. And the most important thing for you to be as a narrator is believable. If you're writing memoir, you have to be believable, and you are not believable if you take yourself too seriously. And which brings me to the point that what makes you likable in real life, in your interpersonal relationships, humor, honesty, a little self-depreciation, a little self-criticism, is exactly what makes you likable as a storyteller and as a narrator. Mary Karr, in The Art of Memoir, puts it like this. She says, "However you charm people in the world, you should do so on the page." Charm is from the Latin carmen, to sing. And by charm, I mean sing well enough to hold the reader in thrall. Whatever people like about you in the world will manifest itself on the page. What drives them crazy will keep you humble. You'll need both sides of yourself, the beautiful and the beastly, to hold the reader's attention. So when we're talking about being a likable memoir or being a likable narrator, it's important to know what we're not meaning. And I'm trying to find them. This is what we don't mean when we talk about being a likable storyteller. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are virtuous. Nobody will believe you if you are the hero of your memoir. People see right through that. So don't tell, but show us your mistakes, your foibles, your quirks. Even, I think, as a spiritual memoir writer, show us your sins. Be honest about your cloudy motives. Be honest about your cloudy memories. Because if you present yourself as the hero of your story, people will doubt that you're telling the truth. This was important for me to do in Searching for Sunday, which is a book about leaving and finding church. I wrote a lot about the reasons why I left the church that I had been in for most of my life. And in doing so, it was really important that I not simply present myself as the victim in those circumstances, because the reality was, while I had strong disagreements with some of what was being said from the pulpit, and there were some circumstances in which I was made to not feel so welcome, the truth was I sometimes rocked the boat for the sake of rocking the boat. There were times when when you're going through an experience of doubt, when you're questioning your faith, you can feel so lonely in that experience that you kind of try to drag everybody you know and love with you through it. And that's something that I did. Tried to kind of don't bring up, the problem of evil at a baby shower. That's kind of basic, human interaction stuff that I forgot. So it's important to include that kind of stuff in your story. Because it makes it believable, and it's the truth, and that's your job, is to show up and tell the truth. Being a likable storyteller also doesn't mean that you're all-knowing. Admit from the start that this is your recollection from your memory, your experience from your memories, and that those memories aren't perfect, that you're putting this together. One thing I would encourage people to avoid, because I'm seeing a lot of this in Christian publishing right now, is the whole, I used to think blah, 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 but now I know. You see this a lot in sort of the post-evangelical memoir genre, where we write about all the things we used to think and how we're so much wiser now. And the worst is when it goes chapter by chapter, like, there's a chapter that says what I used to think about science, what I know now, and then what I used to think about sexuality, what I know now. It's such a turnoff, and it would be an easy fix too. You just rearrange the way that you're telling the story and the arc of the story so that you're taking readers on the journey of discovery that you started and are still on. People are much more interested in the discovery process than in what you find. So be wary of that. I think every spiritual memoir should be a snapshot of someone who is in progress, not all about the truths that they have arrived at. You want to sneak those truths in very strategically and very rarely. Nobody wants to read just a bunch of platitudes. It also doesn't mean that you are popular or beloved. You might be selfish and misanthropic, but the reader will forgive all sorts of sins if you're honest with them about them. So don't try to create yourself to be the life of the party if you are not, in fact. And then for women, I think especially often feel the pressure to write in such a way that they come across as warm and quirky and emotional, lovably frazzled is something I like to say sometimes, politically and theologically soft, and then vulnerable TM, which is its own whole seminar, frankly. But what I mean by that is that sort of a vulnerability that's all about oversharing. And even Brene Brown, let's just say this, Brene Brown, who has really made vulnerability the new it thing, says that vulnerability is based on mutuality and requires boundaries and trust. It's not oversharing. It's not purging. It's not indiscriminate disclosure, and it's not celebrity style social media information dumps. So what I see sometimes, particularly with people who write blogs and who publish a lot online, is sharing for the sake of the shock value, sort of sharing for the sake of sharing, as though the sharing itself has inherent artistic value. But as a writer, your disclosures should serve a purpose, and that purpose is uncovering something true within the reader. Not just sharing for sharing's sake. You need to be sharing because it uncovers something that's universally true and that with which the reader can relate. And the reality is, true vulnerability in our lives requires real risk among friends and family who know us well, not just an audience. And so it's my contention that a life of true vulnerability that requires risk, that requires relationships, that's reciprocal, happens offline and off the page, but then informs what you write on the page and online. And that a life that's characterized by that kind of healthy vulnerability will produce inevitably better writing, because you're writing from a place of healthy risk, and you're writing from a wellspring of material because you've actually lived your life, not just online, but in the day-to-day. I'll say a little bit more about vulnerability in a minute, but that's just my thoughts on that. And I don't know, I've talked with some guys who are writers. I think sometimes they feel pressure to write with a voice that's more authoritative and that's a bit more edgy, sort of like, oh, you have to say something new and exciting and edgy. And I cannot tell you how many books I get in the mail that it's like, oh, this guy has finally discovered the true message of Jesus. There's like 15 of those every season. So men and women just face, different stereotypes and different expectations. But don't write like a woman, a man, or like a pastor, or like a Southerner, or like a theologian. Write like you, and we'll believe you. What a likable storyteller does mean is that you're human. You're complex, motivated by virtue and vice. People can sniff it out if the narrator doesn't sound like a regular human being. Honest, funny. And when I say funny, I don't mean necessarily laugh out loud funny. And there are writers who can do laugh out loud funny really, really well. I'm not sure I'm one of them. I kind of like to put a few little zingers in that are more indicative of my actual sense of humor, which is a bit more dry, a little more, a bit more, a little sarcastic sometimes, but that fits me. Trying to write laugh out loud lines when that's not really your gift that can go badly fast. And I'm glad I've had editors to tell me that it went badly. So, but people like a storyteller who is in some ways funny and especially self-critical. That's also important. Somebody who can tell a good tale, and then vulnerable in the sense of writing about experiences from life that reveal a commitment to being honest and authentic. And I think if we want to talk about vulnerability, a good example is when I was looking through all those memoirs and figuring out what people had done, what I noticed time and time again is that all of them told really compelling and interesting stories about their childhood. Everyone is vulnerable when they're children. So if you want to infuse your memoir with vulnerability, you can write about when you were a child, because there you have enough distance to see the value in it, to see where it might actually help readers and be something that they can relate to. It's been said to write from your scars, not your wounds. And I think that childhood gives us enough distance to write from our scars, not our wounds. And I want to read some examples of this, because I think this is what vulnerability ought to look like, as opposed to what we see so much of. This is in Bird by Bird, and she's writing about her childhood. This is so great. I love this. She says, I started writing when I was 7 or 8. I was very shy and strange looking, loved reading above everything else, weighed about 40 pounds at the time, and was so tense that I walked around with my shoulders up to my ears like Richard Nixon. I saw a home movie once of a birthday party I went to in the first grade with all these cute little boys and girls playing together like puppies, and all of a sudden I scuttle across the screen like Prufrock's crab. I was very clearly the one who was going to grow up to be a serial killer or keep dozens and dozens of cats. I love that, scuttling across the screen like Prufrock's crab. Brilliant. So good. And then Blue Like Jazz, which is Donna Miller's first memoir, which, you know, I love. To this day, I love this book. He talks about his childhood in a really beautiful way. And this is just on page 1. And just hear the vulnerability here. My father left home when I was young, so when I was introduced to the concept of God as Father, I imagined him a stiff, oily man who wanted to move into our house and share a bed with my mother. I can only remember this as a frightful and threatening idea. We were a poor family who attended a wealthy church, so I imagined God as a man who had a lot of money and drove a big car. At church, they told us we were children of God, but I knew God's family was better than mine. That he had a daughter who was a cheerleader and a son who played football. I was born with a small bladder, so I wet the bed till I was 10, and later developed a crush on the homecoming queen who was kind to me in a political sort of way, which is something she probably learned from her father, who was president of a bank. And so from the beginning, the chasm that separated me from God was as deep as wealth and as wide as fashion. Now, to me, that's vulnerability, writing about your childhood in that way, with enough distance to see the effect that it had on you and your perception of God, and with enough insight to write it in such a way that it's helpful to readers and that readers can relate to it. Vulnerability is not getting on Facebook and telling everybody what's wrong with your marriage, or telling everybody how you feel about yourself that day. True vulnerability, I think, happens in the context of real life, not online. And in writing is manifest when you have had time to consider what part of it is of value to the reader. Because only in that way is it actually, as Brene Brown said, mutually beneficial. And then one other author I want to just bring to your mind real quick, as far as somebody who writes about their childhood in a really just brilliant way, is the entire book is so good. Jesus, My Father, the CIA, and Me by Ian Cron, who is one of my very, very favorite writers, is a great example of writing about your childhood in a great way. And then finally, to be a likable storyteller, I said you need to be human, you need to be honest, funny, you need to be able to tell a good story, vulnerable, and then above all else, you must be believable. That is your task as somebody who writes personal narrative. You must be believable, because readers will sniff it out if you're lying to them, even in the most subtle way. And a way to do this is to be sure to focus on details. This is another thing that's hanging on my board. This was something I wrote specifically for Searching for Sunday, because I really wanted to remind myself to infuse humor in what was otherwise a kind of a really personal and serious journey, and hope. Anytime you write about the church, I have to always try and remind myself to not sink in this, infuse the writing with hope. And then details. Details will make or break your writing. And remember, when we're talking about details, we're talking about incorporating the 5 senses: touch, taste, smell, sight, and sound. Mary Carr said, every memoir should brim over with the physical experience that once streamed in. The smell of garlicky gumbo, your hand in an animal's fur, for lighting up bodies underwater, all acid green. I love that. This is, show don't tell is said so many times, it's almost cliche among writers, but it's so important. And I think it's especially important for those of us who are writing so-called spiritual memoirs. And I kind of hate that spiritual memoir label, because it makes it sound so esoteric, when really those of us who are writing God, those of us who are writing about the gospel must sink those words into the stuff of everyday life. Because at the heart of the gospel is this God who is present in bread, in wine, in water, in poetry, in oil, and incense. This is a God who told stories about farming, about baking, about weddings, about road trips. A God whose primary work when living among us was to tell stories, to heal people of their physical ailments, and to eat with his friends. So at the heart of the gospel is a God who took on flesh and drank and slept and cried and sneezed and suffered among us. And so spiritual memoir writers, people who write about faith, have no excuse to go into esoteric headland. We need to be writing a little from our heads and a little from our hearts, but mostly from our hands. And I really think Barbara Brown Taylor, who I love, and Dan always makes fun of me because at the Beekner Writers Workshop, I met her. And I've met some famous people like Whoopi Goldberg and people, all the cast of The View, and I was totally chill. When I met Barbara Brown Taylor, I just like wigged out. I was just like a schoolgirl, and Dan has never seen me like that. And to this day, he kind of teases me about it. So I met Barbara and I was like, because her writing is so indicative of this idea of living and writing incarnationally. And the talk she gave at the event was just so good. And for books for her, I recommend everything the woman has ever written, but especially An Altar in the World. I think that's one of her best on this. So if you're writing about like leaving church because you were struggling with doubts, that's a big part of my story. Don't tell me I left the church because I was doubting God. Tell me, can you remember the moment you first realized that was the case? What were you standing in church? And if you were standing in church, what hymns were playing? Who was at the organ? What were you wearing, and how did it feel on your skin? Who was sitting next to you, and what did they smell like? How did the light look coming in the windows? And when you stood there feeling at once surrounded by all of these people, but also all alone, what did that feel like inside? This was important for me to keep in mind, especially with Searching for Sunday. This is the book I've referred to it several times. It's on sale on Amazon. The ebook is only $1.99 right now, so pick it up. But this was a huge challenge for me in writing this book because I wanted to write the story about struggling to find a church and feeling like a misfit in the churches I had belonged to, because I'm a doubter, because I have questions, and I was always the person raising her hand at the wrong time and bringing up the wrong topic, and I wanted to write about that, but in a way it was something, and so I wasn't sure how to write about baptism, but I could write about my baptism. So what I'm trying to say is what the solution I found when I was struggling to figure out how to tell this story about my experience with church and about what the church is experiencing as a whole in our culture, to keep myself from getting too sort of esoteric about it, I arranged the entire book around the sacraments. So baptism, communion, confession, holy orders, anointing the sick, and so on. And that way, I wasn't sure I could talk about like the future of the church, but I could talk about who baptized me, what it felt like, who was around me, what happened after, who was ready to dry my hair because it was all wet. I could tell that story, and in the particulars of that, I think a truth could emerge. And so it's an example of how important it is to anchor your story in tales that you can tell that involve the senses, things you can taste, touch, smell, and feel. And I want to read a little section of the book that is kind of like what I was describing to you before. And this is chapter 26, and it's called Easter Doubt. Off and on like a rock in your shoe, or startle you like the first crash of thunder in a summer storm, or lodge itself beneath your skin like a splinter, or show up again, the uninvited guest whose heavy footsteps you'd recognize anywhere, appearing at your front door with a suitcase in hand at the worst possible time. Doubt will pull you further out to sea like a riptide, or hold your head under as you drown, triggered by an image, a question, something the pastor said, something that doesn't add up, the unlikelihood of it all, the too good to be trueness of it. The way the lady in the thick perfume behind you sings, "Up from the grave he arose," with more confidence in a single line of a song than you've managed to muster in the past 2 years. Has it really been that long? And you'll be sitting there in the dress you pulled out from the back of your closet, swallowing down the bread and wine, not believing a word of it. Not a word. So you'll fumble through those back pocket prayers, "Help me in my unbelief," while everyone around you moves on to verse 2, verse 3, verse 4 without you. You will feel their eyes on you, and you will recognize the concern behind their cheery greetings. "We haven't seen you here in a while. So good to have you back." And you will know they are thinking exactly what you used to think about Easter Sunday Christians: nominal, lukewarm, indifferent. But you won't know how to explain that there's nothing nominal or lukewarm or indifferent about standing in this hurricane of questions every day and staring each one down until you've mustered all the bravery and fortitude and trust it takes to whisper just one of them out loud in the car ride home. What if we made this up because we're afraid of death? And you won't know how to explain why, in that moment when the whisper rose out of your mouth like Jesus from the grave, you felt more alive and awake and resurrected than you have in ages, because at least it was out. At least it was said. At least it wasn't buried in your chest anymore, clawing for freedom. And if you're lucky, someone in the car will recognize the bravery of the act. If you're lucky, there will be a moment of holy silence before someone wonders out loud if such a question might put a damper on Easter brunch. But if you're not, if the question gets answered too quickly, or if the silence goes on too long, please know you're not alone. There are other people singing words to hymns they're not sure they believe today. Other people digging out dresses from the backs of their closets today. Other people ruining Easter brunch today. Other people just showing up today. And sometimes just showing up, burial spices in hand, is all it takes to witness a miracle. So I think that reveals the importance of anchoring that story in details that the reader can, as they read along with you, sort of taste, touch, smell, and hear what you're experiencing with you, instead of just saying, "I had doubts on Easter and it's up." So I hope that's helped. All that was helpful for how to develop a strong and believable voice, particularly in the oversharing age. And but then there are a few more things I think we need to consider real quick. And I put these in the format of frequently asked questions that people often have for me. So hopefully we'll be able to answer some of these before we have the questions from everybody. But I think that this hit a few notes that I still need to hit about writing memoirs and how to do it in a way that's sustainable and life-giving for you as the author as well. The first question everybody always has for me is, how do you write about people who have been unkind to you? And I know this is sacrilege from a writer of spiritual memoirs, but I actually disagree with Anne Lamott on this. Anne Lamott says if people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. And to a degree, I agree with her on that, but I also think that you have to be aware of the fact that as a writer, you are telling the story from your point of view, and your point of view is indeed skewed. And we should all be a little bit suspicious of our memory, and we should be forthright with the readers and give them permission to be a little suspicious too. Nobody does this better than Mary Karr. It's so important at the outset of the memoir to go ahead and admit that these memories are cobbled together in your mind, and they represent your perspective on them. Fairy tales have one-dimensional villains. A good memoir does not. And so be sure that when you're writing about other people, even those who have not been kind to you, that you don't cast them as the villain and you as the victim, because honestly, it's probably not the truth. And then real quick, Mary Karr says something so brilliant about this in The Art of Memoir. She says, I still try to err on the side of generosity toward any character. Like I mentioned my mother throwing my birthday lasagna at my daddy in one of the zillion fights that felt like my fault. But I also mentioned her cleaning it up after he was gone and lighting candles on a German chocolate cake. A scene that, if left out, would have skewed her into seeming worse than she in fact was. Anne Fadiman writes about a 19th century sailor who comes home to a starving family at Christmas with a bushel of oranges. He locks himself in a room and devours them solo while his kids scratch at the door. He's an asshole, right? Until you learn he has scurvy. Metaphorically speaking, I always make room for any evidence of scurvy in my characters, any mitigating ailments. And I think that that's wise advice. So be careful of casting somebody as strictly a villain. Another thing to do when you're writing about interactions you've had with other people, and I learned this the hard way, don't try to just recreate dialogue for the sake of it. With my first memoir, I really felt like, oh, well, good books include lots of dialogue, right? So I'm going to include a lot of dialogue in this. But the thing is, if you're writing from memory, you're going to have to recreate a lot of that dialogue. And it's the most you are literally putting words in other people's mouths when you do that. And I think it's where you're most vulnerable to misrepresenting people is in recreating dialogue. You always remember people being like, either smarter than they actually were and more winsome, or like meaner. So be careful. Like, you don't have to include a ton of dialogue in your memoirs. And Mary Karr writes about how in her first memoir, she included dialogue, but then as she progressed as a writer and in her later memoirs, the way she even writes the dialogue, it's not quotations and sort of how you imagine it traditionally, but she writes it within the paragraph and within it's sort of like you have a much better sense of the fact that this is going on in her head and this is her recollection of it. So there's stylistic things you can do. You don't feel pressured to put in a bunch of dialogue. Your memoir doesn't necessarily need it. Put in a little, and if you can, if you're as good as Mary Karr, do it in such a way that it's very clear to the reader that this is your recollection of that dialogue. And there's a variety of ways to do that. We could talk a little bit more in the question time about that. Kind of wish I had done with the first book. I wish I had not included as much dialogue because I think it sounded false because it was. Another question I get asked is anything off limits when it comes to writing? Absolutely, yes. There should be lots of things off limits, especially in the overshare age. I think it's really important for writers to have secrets and the good kind of secrets, to have a part of their life, whether it's their relationship with their spouse, or in our case, we're being very protective of our son, where there are beautiful moments that are just for you, that don't have to turn into material, that don't have to get put up on Facebook, that don't have to turn into an Instagram picture, because at the end of the day, when all the likes are gone, when all the readers are gone, the audience is gone, you're left with you. And you need some things for just you. And that's struck me as more and more important as time goes on, and especially with our little guy. I'm sure that I'll be writing about him to some degree, and certainly I'll be writing about motherhood. But there have been some moments where I've thought, this would make some killer writing, but you know what? This is just going to be for us. And it's a way of cherishing and taking care of yourself. That I think is really important. So yes, there's plenty, there should be things that are off limits and that you protect as a writer, because you're a person. How do you deal with criticism is another common question that I'm asked. And I like to tell the story of a time when I'd had kind of a rough day writing on the internet. Some people had been mean to me in the comment section and on Twitter. Mostly Calvinist, but we won't get into that. And I was kind of mad about it, and I sat down next to Dan. I folded up my arms and I said, you know what? If I'm going to make it in this boys club of an industry where all these theological guys have to mansplain everything to me, I'm just going to have to toughen up. I'm going to have to be strong. I can't let anything get to me. I'm going to have to be this strong woman. And I'll never forget, Dan turned to me and he said, Rachel, I'm so proud of you, because you are a strong woman, and you have been through a lot, and you really have grown thick skin over the years. But please don't lose your sweet, tender heart, because that's part of what makes you Rachel, and that's one of the things I love best about you. And of course, then I devolved into a bucket of tears because it was such a sweet thing to say. But that's turned into one of my mantras, thick skin, tender heart. Because the thing is, if we shut down the part of ourselves that can be hurt by criticism because we're so afraid of being criticized, and then we shut down the part of ourselves that can be moved with compassion. You can't selectively numb yourself. And so if in an effort to protect yourself from being hurt, numb yourself to those things, then you're also numbing yourself to empathy, to curiosity and compassion and kindness and vulnerability, healthy vulnerability. So that means sometimes you just have to let the criticism hurt. You have to let it sting. One thing that I do is if a criticism kind of gets to me and I'm feeling upset about it, I'll look at the clock and I'll give myself, all right, Rachel, you get 10 minutes to just sulk and indulge and feel really bad for yourself about this. But when those 10 minutes are up, you need to get back to writing. So sometimes you just have to let it sting. I don't have advice for how to avoid being hurt by criticism because I don't want to be the kind of person who isn't hurt by things. Of course, over time, you learn which sources to take more seriously than others. And then another component of this is surrounding yourself with the people who tell you the truth, knowing who your people are. And your people should be people who you know in real life before you were, a blogger, or, before you were Instagramming, and people who are your biggest cheerleaders, but also are not that impressed. Like they love you, but they're not impressed by you, and they will call you out. Those are the kind of people who can tell you and help you discern when a criticism might be of value and when it's not worth paying attention to. So know who those people are. That's been really important to me. My husband's one of those people. And then finally, a question that I get asked a lot is, how do you fend off jealousy? And really, the only way to do that is to write your way through it. That's the answer to so many emotional problems that writers have. It's just, you just have to sit down and get back to work. Because the truth of the matter is, and I believe this with all of my heart, writing is its own reward. Getting published is great. It's very encouraging, and having a lot of readers and getting good feedback is great. But the writing itself is the greatest joy, and it's available to all of us who do this out of the love for it. So if you love to write, write, and that will kind of restore your sense of purpose. Okay, so we're getting a little close on time, and I want to make sure we leave time for questions. So I will and turn it over to Brian.
Sure. No, that's great, Rachel. Thank you so much for such an amazing amount of very practical information about all the nuances of writing memoir. I think that, at least for me, I know this was quite enlightening, and I'm sure all the people will appreciate the great sense of insight that you bring to that process. And, certainly having gone through it a couple of times yourself, it brings a lot of credibility. So, let's open it up to questions. Anyone that has a question can write it in their chat box, and I'll ask Rachel some of those questions. So one here is from Jennifer, and she says, I hear you saying you don't have to have arrived, quote unquote, at a conclusion in order to tell your story, but how do you then know you have something to say?
Well, I think you have something to say if you think it will be relatable to people. Like the selection that I read from Searching for Today, I wrote that in the midst of, I had not arrived anywhere. I was in a place of incredible doubt. And the message that I wanted to just get through to people was, if you're standing in church today and you think I am the only one who isn't sure that any of this is true, you're not the only one who's thinking that. Because ultimately we write and we read to feel less alone. And so if that's the message you have to bring, that's an important message on its own. You don't have to have all of your own questions solved. And I don't want to read somebody who's writing a book from a place of like, I've figured it out. Those people are so boring, and it just kind of it's such a turnoff. I want to read to feel less alone. And so if that's all you have to offer, that's actually an incredible gift to offer the reader, is the sense that we're in this together. You're not, other people experience this. It's such a huge relief as a reader when I read a book and find that on the page. And I know I've done my job as a writer when people come up to me in the book signing line and they're not saying my questions about Christianity or, oh, you restored my hope in the church. 10 people hug me, put their head on my shoulder, and they say, you let me know I wasn't alone. And I feel like that I did my job, because that's so healing to hear that. So if that's your message, then it's worth it, whether or not you've got to figure it out. I hope that answers your question.
So another question comes from Alex, and he's referring to Sarah Arthur's conversation earlier today, where one of the things she talked about was writing like you're someone else as a way to start writing. And Alex is asking whether or not that is applicable for writing memoir.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. I mean, that I practiced that myself. Does she mean like basically imitating another writer's style? Because that's an important thing to practice doing, or like getting out of your head sort of and pretending like you're like another person looking in on your experience.
More of the latter, kind of putting on a different hat, so to speak, a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, it's super applicable. Like one thing to do is to sort of, if you're, especially when we were talking about how do you represent other people in your work, and they're like putting yourself in the shoes of the person with whom you're having the conversation is important. Or thinking to myself, how did this look from my parents' perspective? Or how did this look from my sister's perspective or my husband's perspective? And imagining myself to be them for a little bit adds a new angle to it. It's like just standing on the desk and looking at it from a different perspective. So yes, I would say that's applicable. I hope that helps.
So the next question comes from Ruth, who was at the Beekner conference with us and remembers you talking about some time management tools. Would you like to share a little bit about that?
They've all been thrown out the window since I had a kid. So now it's like, I have 5 minutes to write. Let's go. And then actually, in some ways, being forced to write in these tiny little windows is helpful. Time management. Oh my gosh. I'm trying to remember what I said at the beginning. That seems like a million years ago. When you have a kid, everything gets completely thrown out. Yeah, I think one thing that I've really learned, especially recently, is that like I used to think I needed to get in like the perfect headspace to write. So I would need like the right music. I would need to read like an hour of somebody else's memoir, and I would need to like go through the new words that I've learned over the last year, and like that takes like an hour. And really, what I'm doing is procrastinating and telling myself you don't have to have a huge long ritual to get into writing. If you leave a little bit undone, like I said earlier, you can jump right back into it, telling yourself you're doing it all because I don't have time to do that anymore, and I'm realizing, I didn't need that. Actually, I didn't need all that time to prepare. I'm trying to think. I'm not really the best person to ask about time management because I really struggle with that. I think, say about it is the next sentence is not in the refrigerator. And just get to it. And having a baby kind of helped because it forced me to get right to it. I got about 45 minutes per nap and gotta go.
So here's another great question from Mary. She says, you stated that writing from your scars and not your wounds, or I'm sorry, you started writing from your scars and not your wounds. If you find yourself in the wounds, does that indicate that it's not ready for others or ready for publication? I
think so. I do. I think that doesn't mean it's not ready to be written. Go ahead and write it. Who's the poet that said that poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility? I can't remember. Like Blake, maybe. That sounds good. It was an English poet. But I think there's a lot of truth to that. The truth of a painful experience often takes a little while to emerge. And then depending on the experience, it might be the next day, it might be the next decade. And you'll know, I think. but get it down, get those raw emotions down, and share them with the right people, I think. But I don't necessarily recommend jumping on Facebook and hitting publish, because I have made that mistake many, many times. And I've been making it during the political season, writing from emotion instead of like, is this helpful to anybody? Wait until you think there's a truth emerging from it that will be helpful to people. I know not every writer will agree with me on that, and maybe we could have an interesting discussion about it. But I think it's a good practice, not just because I think it makes better writing, but also because I think it's better for your soul. Out there, some things deeply personal to share about your suffering is a very vulnerable, scary thing to do. And if you're not at least on the path to healing from it, I think exposing it to hundreds or thousands of people might not be the best for your healing. And actually healing as a person is more important than writing like epic emotional stuff, I think. So yeah, I think it might be worth waiting just a little bit. It's so much easier to see a pattern emerge, a story emerge when you have some distance. I think that's why a lot of writing teachers will tell you, if you're stuck, to just start with your childhood, because it's perfect, because you have enough distance to see stories emerge and to see what might be universal in the particulars there, so that you're and which details are important. It's sort of like when you're in the midst of a really emotional experience, it's almost like it's hard to know which of those details actually are important and which are just these red alarms in your head. So write it down. My advice is to write it down. Get down your raw emotions in the moment, but then wait a little while before you hit publish or send it to a publisher. And I think you'll be glad that you did.
Makes a lot of sense, Rachel. So there are two questions that I'm going to ask her because they're kind of related. Carrie asks, can you talk a bit about how you came to be published? And Melissa talks about, in this literary climate, do you think it's necessary to have a blog before a publisher will look at your manuscript?
Good question. Let me do that one first, and then remind me of just the general publishing. Well, I guess it kind of answers this. The thing is that blogging is changing so dramatically. It's not the same as when I first started blogging. Comments are different than they used to be. The community of blogging is different than it used to be. And so I'm not as confident speaking about relevance now as I was back when I first got started, which brings me to how I got published. For me, blogging was immensely helpful for building a platform and for basically connecting with my readers. I had my first book deal before my blog was very popular, but as I was writing that book, I was really growing a blogging audience. And so I had an audience that was very eager to get my book, and especially my second book, because I kept writing, and I was writing every single day on the blog. Now I'm not writing every single day, but when I did write every single day on the blog, whoo, the numbers were like out the roof. And it was incredibly helpful because I had readers to sell books to. And more importantly, I think, I feel like one of my gifts as a writer is that I know my readers. I know what they like. I know what they don't like. I know, how they feel about things. I mean, they're all different, and yet a community emerges, and the same questions start getting asked over and over again. The same struggles keep getting expressed. When you're meeting your readers online, whether that's through Facebook or blogging or whatever, them in your head a little bit. And so when I sit down to write, I'm very clear on who I'm writing for. And that's incredibly helpful. It's a mistake a lot of people make, I think, is they're just kind of writing for whoever. I can think of names of people who are readers of my blog who I'm writing this section for, like there's a whole chapter in Searching for Sunday I wrote for Ben, like a guy that reads my stuff on the internet. But I knew he would relate to this so much based on my conversations that we had had. So I think it's important to be writing online somewhere, and helpful to be writing online somewhere for developing a sense of who your readers are, and to connect with those readers and to have them ready to buy your books, if that's what you decide to do. And of course, there's just the practical element of it that publishers are looking for writers with a platform and writers who have built-in eager to buy readers. So, these days you put your Twitter followers in your book proposal, which, I mean, on the one hand, yes, there's a troubling element to that to me as well, but that's life, and that's the reality of the market right now. So I think it's important, but it's so much more important to actually have a connection with these people that you're writing for and to than it is to just accumulate the numbers. So that kind of touched on my publishing experience. Basically, I started with a proposal for Evolving in Monkey Town, which was a memoir, and pitched it to agents. And Rochelle Gardner is my agent to this day, and she picked it up and thought it was great. And I had basically no following at the time, but she liked the writing and saw some promise there. And so she pitched it to publishers. And Zondervan was my first publisher. And I will say I got rejected by quite a few publishers in that process. So I know people get tired of hearing this, but it really is part of the deal. And then for the second book, my publisher is Thomas Nelson. Third book is also with Thomas Nelson, and that was a 2-book deal. So the fourth book, which don't tell anybody, was due like a year ago, and is still in process, is also with Thomas Nelson. So I've been pretty happy with them these last few books. They've really given me a lot of freedom, and they've been extraordinarily patient. So that's good.
So one thing that we should touch on is upcoming speaking events, places where people will be able to see you in person. I know one of them is the White Christian Conference. You want to talk about that for a second?
Yes, I'm glad you went to one that I know when and where it is. I'm sort of living a week at a time, a day at a time right now. So it's I get an email from my assistant. It's you're going to Shreveport next week, and that's when I know I'm going to Shreveport. So yes, Chicago, the last weekend in September, 1st of October. So it's September 29th through October 1st, is White Christian. It's a conference that I put on with Nadia Bowles-Weber, who is a dear friend of mine. This is why I love Christian writing, because Nadia and I have basically nothing in common. I'm super sweet and Southern and try to make, smooth everything over. And she's tattooed and she cusses like a sailor. And basically she would have scared me in high school. And now we're fast friends because of this crazy world of religious writing. And so White Christian is an event that we're doing it in Chicago this year. And what we've done is we ask, this year it's 9 people, why they're Christians. And these are people who are sometimes they're pastors, sometimes they're people who have had very difficult experiences with church. Other times, they're people who are working in avenues of social justice, and they're people who are a little under the radar, we think, but who we see are about to really break through in a big way, or just they're people we really feel like their story is valuable. And we just ask them, why are you a Christian? And they talk for 15 minutes about it. It's basically old school testimony time. And at the last event, we could not have anticipated how moving and powerful it would have been. So, and it was just phenomenal hearing people's stories about why, in the midst of, there's so many reasons to give up on Christianity, why they're still Christians. And we heard from, the great thing was this amazing mix of people, like a Baptist preacher who's the first transgender Baptist preacher. We had, the pastor of a tiny urban church that, takes up $20 an offering every week. We heard from just a whole range. Yeah, we had Methodist, we had Evangelical, we had Catholic, we had just a really interesting range of people. And it was so encouraging to hear their stories. So the takeaway to me was that stories are compelling. When you ask somebody to tell their story, people listen. So yes, I think we're sold out. So maybe I've spent too much time talking about it because I don't know if anybody can jump in. But we're very excited about it, and we'll do it again next year. So keep an eye out for it.
Well, certainly we haven't opened up registration yet for the Writers Workshop at Western Seminary, so we don't have to worry about being sold out for that. So I mentioned at the beginning of the show that Rachel will be keynoting that event along with Barbara Brown Taylor. It's in Holland, Michigan at Western Seminary and Hope College in May of 2017. I believe it's May 16th and 17th. And all of you who have registered for this event will be on the email list for further announcements about that. But Rachel mentioned earlier about how much she enjoys being with Barbara. So
I don't know if enjoys the right word. Like, I was so embarrassed. Well, and then I was giving my workshop later, and I mean, I had prepared for my workshop, but it wasn't like perfect, and she walks in after I was starting and she's like, "Can I sit in on this?" And I'm like, "Ah." So then it's like my expectations for the workshop went from like, I hope that people learn something and that this is a valuable experience to them, to like, don't throw up. Like, that was my goal. And I'm telling you, Dan was so amused because like, I just don't do this with anybody else. I've never freaked out like this before. But yes, maybe this time I'll be a little bit more like.
You were perfectly fine. You did a great presentation that day, so you didn't let it show if you were freaking out.
I love her so much.
Well, that concludes our webinar for this evening. Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank everyone that's joined us. Our next webinar will be tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern with Lil Copan from Erdman's Publishing, and she is going to present Discovering What Publishers Are Looking For. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. And Rachel, thank you again.
Real quick,
go ahead.
If you have questions that I didn't get to, hop on over, like, I guess to my Facebook page, or unless you have a different forum you'd rather than use, and I can answer those over the next few days.
Yeah, no, that's fine. If you'd like to do that, or you can use my email address, which is brian@writingforyourlife.com, and I'm glad to forward things to Rachel from there as well.
Yeah, I'll do Facebook though, because my email is a sad pit of despair. So on that note.
All right, well, give Henry a hug for us, and thanks again, Rachel. We'll talk to you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.